The water is warm, flat, and barely waist deep. That is where people drown. In 9 days in June 2023, rip currents killed 7 people at Panama City Beach, several in water already closed by flag. This is Florida's Gulf Shore, about 770 miles of sand on one of the widest, shallowest continental shelves on Earth. The obvious answer is that it's shallow here. The shallowness is the weapon. Why does a coast with no cliffs, no cold current, and waves under 3 feet kill faster than shorelines that look lethal? The 1993 answer arrived after midnight, unannounced. To see the machinery, you have to stop looking at the water and start looking at what sits underneath it. Off Tampa Bay, the seafloor slides away from the beach for roughly 75 miles before it reaches anything a geologist would call a slope. Off the Big Bend, and again off Charlotte Harbor, that ramp runs closer to 110 miles. For nearly all of that distance, the depth is measured in tens of feet, not hundreds. There is no drop-off out there, no canyon, no wall, no deep trench close to shore where the energy of a storm can go down instead of sideways. Geologists call it the West Florida Shelf. It is one of the broadest, gentlest continental shelves in the world, and it behaves less like an ocean floor than like a boat ramp 100 miles long. Wind does not push water down. It drags it. Over deep water, that dragged surface layer can sink, spread, and circulate away beneath itself, which is why a storm crossing open ocean piles up surprisingly little. Over a shelf that is only 40 or 50 feet deep, there is no beneath. Friction couples the wind to the entire water column, top to bottom, and the whole thin sheet gets shoved horizontally toward the only thing that can stop it, which is Florida. Give that process 10 or 12 hours of a steady onshore gale, and the water does not rise a few inches. It stacks. The same storm that produces 5 feet of surge on a steep coast can produce 12 or 15 here, and it can start doing it while the storm's center is still 100 miles out to sea. That is the part that kills, and it kills through a very ordinary object, a road. Barrier islands and coastal towns along this shore sit a few feet above the water they overlook. The causeway or the 2-lane out to the highway is almost always the lowest ground in the neighborhood, lower than the houses, lower than the parking lots. Surge does not have to reach your floor to end your options. It only has to reach the road, and the road is what you were planning to use. Most Florida emergency agencies stop rolling trucks and ambulances once sustained winds reach tropical storm force. That is a published operating limit, not a failure of nerve. And it means the rescue window on this coast closes hours before the storm arrives. A woman who decides at 9 at night that she has changed her mind about staying is not making a late decision. She is making a decision that expired at 4 in the afternoon. The same shallowness runs the coast's other killer, and this one needs no storm at all. Waves crossing 100 miles of shallow ramp lose energy to friction the entire way. They come ashore short, low, closely spaced, and unimpressive, 2 feet, sometimes less. All that water still has to go somewhere. Waves push it over the sandbars that lie parallel to the beach, and the sea level inside the bar rises a few inches above the sea level outside it. Water always finds the cheapest way back out. It runs sideways along the trough behind the bar, finds the gap, and drains seaward through it like a bathtub finding its plug. Squeeze through a break maybe 50 or 80 feet wide, that return flow accelerates. Typical rip currents run 1 to 2 feet per second. Some have been measured at 8, which is faster than any Olympic swimmer has ever gone. It does not pull you under. It carries you out, and it does it while you are still standing in water you could kneel in, on a day when the surf would not knock over a toddler. Long before anyone measured that, people here had solved the elevation problem the hard way. On Mound Key, an island in Estero Bay just off what is now Fort Myers Beach, the Calusa spent something like 15 centuries turning shellfish dinner into terrain. A geoarchaeological study published in PLOS One in 2016, based on systematic coring, excavation, and radiocarbon dating, found deposits there running from about a meter below modern sea level to more than 9 meters above it, 9 meters. 30 feet of engineered ground on a coast that offers none, built out of oyster and conch shell, hauled and packed and terraced by people who had no metal tools and no reason to do the work except that the water came. They cut canals through it. They built water courts to hold fish. They did not fight the Gulf, and they did not ignore it. They lived on this coast by refusing to live at its elevation. Modern Florida inverted that exactly. The value of this shoreline is the view, and the view requires being low and being close. So the money went to the sand, and the ground it went to sits 3 to 8 feet above the sea, protected by insurance, building codes, and the reasonable observation that most years nothing happens. That is not stupidity. It is a bet with good odds, renewed annually, by hundreds of thousands of people. The trouble with a bet like that is that the loss is not distributed evenly across the years. It arrives all at once, in the dark, in a single night that nobody had marked on the calendar as dangerous. March is not on that calendar at all. March is the safe month, the month between the cold fronts and the first tropical waves. And in 1993, it produced a storm that never earned a name and killed more people in Florida than most hurricanes do. The computer models saw it coming 5 days out. That was the strange part. Forecasters watching the guidance in early March saw a low over the Gulf of Mexico deepen at a rate the models had rarely produced, and some of them did not believe it. The word used at the time was bomb, the informal term for a low-pressure system whose pressure collapses violently in under a day. The warnings that went out were about wind and about tornadoes, and those warnings were good ones. At least 11 tornadoes came out of the squall line that raked the peninsula, and the National Weather Service later recorded tornado lead times all above 20 minutes, one of them 48. Everything the forecasters were watching for, they caught. The water was the part nobody had sized correctly. It came ashore late on Friday, March 12th, and drove through the early hours of Saturday the 13th, which meant it arrived in the Big Bend while most of the coast was in bed. Taylor County took a surge that has been surveyed at 9 to 12 feet. Not from a hurricane, from a March low with no name, no category, and no cone. The worst of it landed on Deckley Beach, a small stilt community of retirees and commercial fishermen where roughly 95% of the homes were damaged, and most of the ones on the front row were simply gone by daylight. Taylor County counted 57 residences completely destroyed. Some of them came off their pilings with families inside. The National Weather Service office serving Tampa Bay attributes 13 surge deaths in Taylor County alone. NOAA's national climate record puts the state's surge and flooding deaths at 7. Those two numbers have never been reconciled, and the gap itself tells you something about a nighttime surge on an unpopulated stretch of coast, which is that the accounting is harder than the meteorology. Depending on which tally you use, the storm killed 44 or 47 people in Florida. Roughly half of the direct deaths were not on land at all. Out on the shelf that same night, the wind that had been stacking water against the Big Bend was doing something else entirely to the boats. The Weather Service estimates seas of 65 feet in the eastern Gulf during the peak of the system. Among the vessels caught in it was the Fantastico, a 200-foot Honduran-flagged freighter working roughly 50 to 60 miles off Fort Myers. She sank. The Coast Guard reached 3 of her crew. 7 were lost. A ship of that size does not go down because of one big wave. She goes down because the sea state stops giving her time. Closely spaced steep waves strike before the hull has finished recovering from the previous one. Water on deck stops draining between impacts. Cargo shifts, and the vessel's ability to right herself degrades wave by wave until it doesn't come back. Nobody aboard had a way to make that stop, and nobody ashore could have reached them in a 65-foot sea if they had. which makes the hurricane season printed on the calendar something close to a marketing document. The shelf does not check the date. It responds to a sustained onshore wind, and a strong extratropical low in March can deliver that just as efficiently as a Category 3 in September, with the added advantage of arriving at an hour when nobody is awake to notice the water. Taylor County rewrote its building codes after 1993. That was the correct response, and it was also a narrow one. Codes govern structures. The thing that had failed was not primarily structural, it was timing and information. The fixes that mattered most over the next decade came from somewhere else: expanded NOAA weather radio coverage, surge modeling that could actually predict inundation for a specific stretch of coast rather than a general height, and out on the water, two devices that changed the arithmetic of the offshore Gulf completely. Cheap GPS, which told you exactly where you were, and the emergency beacon, the EPIRB, which told everyone else. A beacon reduces the search for a person in the Gulf of Mexico from a problem the size of a state to a problem the size of a parking lot. It is the single highest leverage piece of equipment ever put on a small boat. It also has one requirement that no engineer has ever solved, which is that somebody has to buy it, carry it, and know what it is. On Saturday, February 28, 2009, 4 men left Clearwater to fish for amberjack. Marquis Cooper, a linebacker for the Oakland Raiders, owned the boat, a 2005 Everglades center console, 20 feet 9 inches long, rated for 10 people, and a maximum load of 1,450 pounds. A well-built hull. With him were Corey Smith, a defensive end who had played for Detroit and Tampa Bay, and 2 former University of South Florida players, William Bleakley and Nick Schuyler. 4 athletes in their 20s, in excellent physical condition, on a boat that was legally equipped and, by the standards of the Gulf recreational fleet, entirely normal. Cooper had a GPS waypoint saved for a spot about 50 nautical miles west of Clearwater, out where the amberjacks sit on structure in deep enough water. That was the plan. Run out, fish, run back. The weather told them something before they left. At 9:42 on Friday night, NOAA had begun broadcasting a small craft advisory covering Saturday night through Monday. A cold front was coming. The forecast for Saturday itself was manageable. 15-knot southerly winds, seas of 3 to 5 feet. And it deteriorated in stages after that. 20 knots and 4 to 6 feet Saturday night, then 20 to 25 knots out of the northwest with 9 to 12-foot seas on Sunday. Read as a professional would read it, that is a clear instruction. You have a window, the window closes Saturday evening, and you do not want to be 60 miles offshore when the front comes through. They read it the way most people read it, which is that the fishing day was fine. It was February in Florida. 2 of them had NFL schedules. A free Saturday with workable seas in late winter is not a common thing. And the fish were where the fish were, which was 50 miles out. At about 5:30 in the evening, with the light going, they went to pull the anchor, and it would not come. This is where a fishing trip becomes something else, and it happens in less than a minute. A fouled anchor 60 miles offshore with a front behind you is not a catastrophe. It is an annoyance with several standard solutions. You can motor up over it and break it free from directly above. You can cut the line and lose the anchor. What Schuyler later described to investigators is that Bleakley suggested moving the anchor line from the bow cleat, where it had been, back to the stern, near the motor. Then Cooper put the boat ahead on the throttle to break the anchor out. Understand what that does geometrically. A boat's bow is high, sharp, and closed. Its stern is the low, flat, open end, and on a center console, the transom cutout sits inches above the water so you can work fish over it. Move the load to the stern and drive forward against a line that will not give, and the boat cannot lift. The anchor holds, the engine pulls, the pivot goes to the transom, and the lowest, widest, most open part of the vessel is dragged down into the water. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's investigation cited improper anchoring, carelessness, and operator inexperience. The lead investigator, James Manson, put the finding in one plain sentence. They did not know that anchoring from the stern is not safe. The cockpit flooded and the boat went over. 4 men were in the water, 62 nautical miles off Clearwater, in water measured at roughly 62 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with the front due that night. They had Type 2 life jackets, and they got them. They did not have an EPIRB. A fishing companion later said that when the subject had come up, Cooper did not know what one was. They had no life raft, no secondary engine, and no float plan filed with anyone ashore. There was no distress call that reached anyone. Water in the low 60s does not sound like a killer. It sounds like a swimming pool in May. That is precisely why it is the most consistently underestimated number on this coast. The body loses heat roughly 25 times faster in water than in air, and at that temperature, survival without flotation is generally measured at 5 to 7 hours, not days. What kills first is not the temperature reading. It is what the cooling does to judgment, and this is the detail from that night that ought to be taught in every boating class in the state. 3 of the 4 men took their life jackets off. In the standard progression of immersion hypothermia, the reasoning goes before the body does. One of the men reportedly believed he had seen land and swam for it, 60 miles from land, in the dark, with the sea building. Nobody ashore knew any of it had happened. Cooper's wife grew worried when he did not call Saturday evening. The Coast Guard began searching at 2 o'clock Sunday morning, which is the real number in this story. 8.5 hours after the capsize, the search had not yet started, because the first job of a rescue is not going, it is learning. Then came the second problem, and this is the one that defines the Gulf. The Coast Guard did not have a position. It had a habit. Searchers built their patterns around that saved waypoint, the spot about 50 nautical miles west of Clearwater where Cooper liked to fish, and then had to expand outward for drift, because a capsized hull in a 25-knot northwesterly does not stay where it sank. Over 3 days, aircraft and cutters covered more than 24,000 square miles of ocean, an area about the size of West Virginia. While conditions on scene went from 10-foot seas Sunday morning to 15-foot seas by that afternoon, with winds gusting past 40. Search crews were flying and steaming through the same front that was killing the men they were looking for. At about 3 in the afternoon on Monday, March 2nd, a lookout spotted something white and wrong-shaped in the swell. It was the overturned hull, and Nick Schuyler was on it. He was found 35 nautical miles west of St. Petersburg, which is why published accounts of this accident disagree about how far offshore it happened. The capsize was at 62 miles, and the wreck had walked half the width of the search area in 2 days. He had been in and on the water somewhere between 43 and 46 hours, depending on the account. His core temperature was 88.8 degrees. He was still wearing his life jacket. He was the only one who had kept it on, and the only one who had stayed with the hull. Cooper, Smith, and Bleakley were never recovered. Take the beacon they didn't have and put it on that boat, and everything downstream changes. Not the capsize, and a PIRB does not right a swamped hull. But the alarm goes out at 5:31 instead of after midnight. The position is known to within a few hundred yards instead of a few thousand square miles, and a helicopter out of Air Station Clearwater covers those 70-odd miles in well under an hour. The constraint on this coast is almost never the willingness or the capability of rescuers. It is that a rescue cannot begin until someone knows where to look, and the Gulf of Mexico is very good at hiding a 20-foot object. So, a beacon fixes the offshore problem. Fine. Then here's the harder question. What happens when there is no ambiguity at all? When the danger is on national television, its position is known to the mile, and every person in its path has been told. On the morning of October 10, 2018, the people of Mexico Beach, Florida, a town of about 1,000 on the eastern edge of the Panhandle, were deciding whether to leave. They were working from a forecast. 24 hours earlier, the National Hurricane Center's official prediction had Michael topping out as a Category 3 near landfall, around 125 miles per hour. That is a serious storm and a familiar one. This coast has absorbed Category 3s. Plywood goes up. The people with somewhere to go there. And a substantial number of people who have ridden out storms before stay in houses that have survived storms before. Michael's winds increased by 45 miles per hour in the final 24 hours. Rapid intensification is the most operationally cruel thing a hurricane can do because it attacks the one resource evacuation runs on, which is time. The Gulf that October was warm and the wind shear over it was weak, and the storm converted that into strength faster than the guidance could follow. The analyses of shear affecting Michael appear, in hindsight, to have been too high. It came ashore near Mexico Beach and Tyndall Air Force Base. With sustained winds of 160 miles an hour, storm surge inundation at Mexico Beach was surveyed at 9 to 14 feet above ground level. In a town where the ground is a few feet above the sea, that is not flooding. That is the removal of the town, slab by slab, while the wind takes what floats. At the time everyone was making decisions, Michael was a Category 4. In April 2019, after months of post-storm analysis of data that had not been available in real time, the National Hurricane Center revised its landfall intensity to 160 miles per hour and reclassified Michael as a Category 5 at landfall. The first Category 5 to strike the United States since Andrew in 1992, and only the fourth on record. Everybody who stood in a driveway that Wednesday morning weighing whether to load the car was making that call inside a storm that had not yet been measured. The forecast was not incompetent. It was operating at the edge of what atmospheric science can currently do, and the gap between the forecast and the reality was 35 miles per hour of wind and an entire category of surge. Michael's direct death toll in the United States was 16, with another 43 deaths attributed indirectly. For a Category 5 landfall, that is remarkably low, and the reason matters? The Panhandle Shelf is narrower than the shelf under the Big Bend, so Michael's surge, catastrophic as it was locally, did not spread the way a Big Bend surge spreads, and a large share of the population did leave. The lesson people took from Michael was about wind speed and construction standards. The lesson that was actually available was about clocks. Forecast accuracy and decision time are two different commodities, and improving the first does not automatically produce the second. 4 years later, a Florida county made a decision about the second one on purpose. Lee County, on the southwest coast, ran what it called a just-in-time evacuation protocol. The logic is defensible, and it is not unique to Lee. Evacuating early costs money, clogs highways, and if you order people out repeatedly for storms that miss, they stop believing you the time it counts. So the county held. On Monday, September 26, 2022, as Hurricane Ian moved toward Florida, neighboring counties, Charlotte, Sarasota, Manatee, Hillsborough, issued mandatory evacuation orders for their most exposed zones. Lee County's order for its barrier islands and low coastal zones came on Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours before landfall, and a full day after its neighbors, with the forecast track by then shifting south onto them. The people that order had to move were disproportionately elderly. Many of them do not drive at night, do not move quickly, and had nobody to move them. Ian came ashore on September 28th near Cayo Costa. Surveyors afterward measured a water level of 15.5 feet inside a building on Fort Myers Beach, with peak inundation across that community running 10 to 15 feet above ground. 15 feet of water in a one-story building is not survivable by climbing onto furniture. It is survivable by being somewhere else, or by getting into an attic, which is where a number of people in Lee County spent that afternoon. Then the road failed the way the roads here fail. At least 5 sections of the Sanibel Causeway were torn out, which severed the only land connection to Sanibel and Captiva, and stranded an island community of roughly 6,300 people. Everything after that had to fly or float. Helicopters lifted people off the islands. Boats brought in water, fuel, and work crews. And for a stretch of days, the only way onto an American barrier island, a few miles from a major city, was by air, or by hull. Temporary repairs restored vehicle access within weeks, which is fast for that kind of work, and irrelevant to anyone who needed a hospital on Wednesday. A few miles from where that surveyor measured 15.5 feet of water inside a house, Mound Key was still sitting 30 feet above Estero Bay, where it has been for something like 1,500 years. The Calusa did not have a forecast, a cone, a siren, or a causeway. They had one idea, which was height, and they spent centuries building it out of garbage because the water on this coast eventually comes for everything at its own level. Florida's Medical Examiners Commission ultimately attributed 149 deaths in the state to Ian. Drowning was the single leading cause, and Lee County accounted for the largest share of the dead by a wide margin. Most of the victims were older. That combination, surge, elderly population, late order, one road, is not a coincidence of that particular storm. It is the standing configuration of this coast, and Ian simply tested it. The point that gets lost is that Lee County was in the cone. It was warned, it was watched, it was on every national broadcast for 3 days, and its officials were making a calculated call about a real trade-off, which raises the question this coast keeps asking in a different form each time. If the storm is in your forecast cone and you still lose people, what happens in a county the storm does not hit at all? On September 26, 2024, Hurricane Helene made landfall in Florida's Big Bend, in the sparsely populated marsh country roughly 180 miles north of Tampa Bay. Pinellas County, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, and the chain of barrier islands between them was not near the center. It was on the eastern side of an enormous circulation, which meant that for the better part of a day, the wind blew from the Gulf onto that shelf, and the shelf did the only thing it knows how to do. Pinellas took the worst surge it had seen in 103 years. Water reached 8 feet in places, ran through neighborhoods at around 4 feet, and it did it in the evening and into the night. 12 people died in Pinellas County. Every one of them was inside mandatory evacuation zone A, they had been told. The National Hurricane Center issued its first storm surge warning for that coast 2 days ahead. The county issued mandatory evacuation orders. The forecast was not vague, not late, and not wrong. It named the water, the height, and the timing. Sheriff Bob Gualtieri's public assessment afterward was blunt. They made their case, they told people what they needed to do, and people chose otherwise. Look at who died, and the choice becomes more understandable and much sadder. They were largely older residents of Indian Rocks Beach, Madeira Beach, and the mobile home communities. Aiden Bowles, 71, Frank Wright, 71, Donna Fagerston, 66, Patricia Mikos, 80. Bowles told his caregiver it was going to be fine, that he was going to go to bed. That sentence is the whole failure in 11 words, and it was not stupid. It was empirical. These same residents had been ordered out for Adalia in 2023 and again for Debbie that August, and both times the water had come up short of the disaster they were promised. Every correct warning that is followed by a manageable outcome spends down the credibility of the next one. That is not a character flaw of Floridians. It is how humans calibrate a repeated risk with an invisible mechanism, and the mechanism here is genuinely invisible. You cannot see a 100-mile shelf from your porch, and nothing about a storm making landfall 180 miles up the coast looks like it should put 4 feet of salt water through your living room at 10 at night. Helene is the strongest single argument in this entire story, because it removes every excuse. The science worked. The warning was early, specific, and accurate. The evacuation zone was drawn correctly, and it was drawn correctly decades ago. The 12 people who died inside the lines that the state had already identified as the place where people drown. The failure was not in the forecast. It was in the last 100 feet of the chain, in the gap between a number issued by a federal agency and a decision made by an 80-year-old at 9 in the evening, with a car, a cat, and nowhere obvious to go. The water went down. The hazard did not. 2 weeks after Helene, Hurricane Milton crossed the same coast, and the combination did something to the biology of the shoreline that the surge maps do not model. Vibrio vulnificus is a bacterium that lives naturally in warm, brackish water, exactly what you get when a Gulf surge pushes into estuaries, canals, and flooded streets, and then sits there in October heat. It infects through open wounds and through raw shellfish. It moves fast, and in vulnerable people, it is frequently fatal. Florida logged 82 cases and 19 deaths in 2024, the worst year on record for the state, and the Department of Health directly attributed the spike to flooding from Helene and Milton. The counties with the unusual increases were the ones the surge reached: Pinellas, Pasco, Hernando, Citrus, Hillsborough, Sarasota, Lee. People who survived the water were being killed weeks later by what the water left, often through a cut they picked up while cleaning out their own house. Every mechanism in this story so far has needed a storm. The most consistent one doesn't. Go back to Panama City Beach on an ordinary June evening with no low-pressure system anywhere on the map. Bay County flies a flag system on that beach: green, yellow, single red for hazardous conditions, double red meaning the water is closed. In 2023, red or double red flags flew every single day from June 12th. Over 9 days from June 15th to June 24th, the National Weather Service counted 7 deaths there. Several of those people entered water that was formerly closed, in front of signs, in front of flags, on a beach where the sheriff's office had been publishing warnings for a week. On one Sunday alone, Bay County 911 dispatchers handled 36 water rescue calls in 12 hours. By the end of that year, Panama City Beach had recorded more surf zone deaths than any other location in the United States. One of them was Christopher Pierce, 47, of Helena, Alabama, on vacation with his family. On Father's Day, June 18th, at about 3:45 in the afternoon, on a red flag day, his daughter got into trouble in the water, and he went in after her. He got her out. The police chief's account afterward was that Pierce reached her, got her clear of the current, and was then caught by it himself. Beach safety officers and county paramedics worked on him on the sand and could not bring him back. That is the ordinary version of this death, and it is far more common than the reckless one. The person who drowns on this coast is very often the person who went in to help somebody else. The Bay County Sheriff said publicly that he was beyond frustrated. You can hear why. From the outside, it looks like pure recklessness. A warning was posted. The warning was ignored. People died. Stand on the sand and it looks entirely different. And this is the part worth understanding, because the flags are competing against the most persuasive evidence a human being has, which is their own eyes. A rip current in low surf is close to invisible. On a coast with big breakers, the rip announces itself. You can see the flat, choppy, discolored lane cutting seaward through the white water, because there is white water for it to cut through. On the Gulf, where the swell arrives already ground down to 2 feet, there is barely any breaking at all. The dangerous lane looks like the calmest part of the beach, which it is. That is exactly why it is dangerous, because the water there is not breaking, it is leaving. Parents put children in the calm gap between the breakers on purpose. And there is no cold to warn anybody, no shock on entry, no discomfort, nothing that the body reads as an environment that could kill it. The Gulf in June is bathwater. On June 21st, 2024, a single red flag was flying. hazardous, not closed. At about 8 in the evening, 3 men from Birmingham, Alabama, went into the water. Harold Denzel Hunter, 25, Jamonda Ray, 24, and Marius Richardson, 24. The Bay County Sheriff's Office received a report of 3 swimmers in distress shortly after 8. From entering the water to being in serious trouble took roughly 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that is the entire span. A rip moving at even 2 feet per second puts a swimmer 100 yards from the beach inside a minute and a half, and 100 yards offshore in the Gulf is water where you cannot stand. Nothing about that trip is violent. There is no wave that hits you, no undertow that drags you down. That word describes something that does not exist. There is only a steady seaward drift, an increasing distance, and the instinct that ends most of these deaths, which is to swim straight back at the beach you can see. Swimming into a rip at your maximum effort is a treadmill. The current does not tire. You do in a few minutes, and once your arms fail in water over your head, warm water drowns you exactly as efficiently as cold. Ordinary people nearby went in after them. A family at the scene joined the search in the dark. All 3 men were pulled from the water. All 3 died at the hospital. Between June 20th and June 23rd of 2024, 6 people drowned along that stretch of coast. That is the shape of this coast's most reliable killer. No storm, no boat, no darkness, no cliff, no cold. A red flag, a warm evening, and 100 yards. The United States Life-Saving Association has calculated that the chance of drowning at a beach guarded by their lifeguards is about 1 in 18 million. That number matters because it proves the problem is not that this water is unsurvivable. It is that on 770 miles of shoreline, most of the sand cannot be watched. The warning system on most Gulf beaches is a colored flag, a sign at the boardwalk, and a patrol that cannot be in front of you at 8 in the evening when you decide the water looks fine. A flag communicates a probability. Your eyes communicate a certainty. The eyes win, and they are wrong. And the reason they are wrong is that everything the eyes are reading, the small waves, the warm water, the shallow shelf, the gentle slope, is generated by the same geology that is about to move you offshore. That is the system, and it runs from the sea floor up. 100 miles of shallow ramp means wind has something to push against for hours, so surge builds to heights this coast's elevation cannot absorb, and it arrives on the low road first, which closes the exit before the storm gets there. The same ramp grinds swell down into waves too small to look threatening, while feeding the sandbar and gap system that drains seaward at speeds no swimmer can beat. The same ramp puts the good fishing 60 miles out, past the edge of easy help, over water, warm enough to seem harmless, and cold enough to end a healthy man in a night. Weather activates all of it, whether it comes as a hurricane, an unnamed March low, or a Tuesday afternoon breeze. Human motive supplies the exposure, the view, the fish, the free weekend, the house that has stood through 4 storms. Technology has genuinely changed one part of it. The forecasts are earlier and sharper than they have ever been. The surge warnings are specific to the neighborhood. The beacons work. The helicopters fly. And it has not touched the 2 things that actually determine who lives, how long you have to act, and whether anyone knows where you are. What has improved on this coast is measurement. We can now say, 2 days out, how deep the water will be on a named street, and say it to the person standing on that street holding a phone. Measurement is not the same as time, and it is not the same as position. Every death in this account came out of one of those 2 shortages, people who ran out of hours, and people nobody could find. A surge forecast does not raise a road. A beacon does not right a hull. A red flag on a pole does not reach a swimmer who is already 100 yards out and cannot hear it. None of that has been repealed. The shelf is still 100 miles wide. The barrier islands are still 3 feet above the water and rebuilding. Larger and more expensive, in the same footprints. The boats still go out 60 miles because that is where the amberjack are, and the Coast Guard still cannot search an ocean it has not been given a position for. Every summer, several million people who have never seen a rip current in their lives will stand at the edge of the flattest, warmest, friendliest-looking sea in America. Some evening in June, the flags will go up double red over an empty stretch of Gulf sand. 2 squares of solid red snapping in an onshore breeze. The water beyond them glassy and green and barely knee-deep at the bar. The surf too small to make noise. And a family will walk past the flagpole toward it, carrying towels, because nothing about it looks dangerous. Nothing about it ever does.